breakout sessions. And one thing that stood out was there was a need for the opportunity for youth, our members, to be able to do some white papers or thought pieces, infographics, 1,000 words or less, or one-page summaries of topics related to what they're doing, industry trends that they're observing, survey of research that they think is really important. A lot of that was mentioned from the industry side, that they need some really digestible material that they can review quickly. And then if they have additional questions for more details, they can reach out to the individual or individuals who wrote that piece, which I think is a great idea. I appreciate those suggestions. So we would encourage you all, if you're interested in doing that, please send us your thought piece that you want to do, and we'll put that up and share it for everybody to read. The other is, we would love to highlight our members, their accomplishments. So if you've gotten that email and you'd like to be highlighted, send us a picture of your smiling face and a little bit about you. And we want to make sure industry is aware of all the great things. If you're industry and you want to be highlighted, we'll do that too, or government as well. So we think those are really important. We really appreciate any feedback we get or activities back. So nobody came to hear me speak. They came to hear Neil speak. Neil has led a pretty varied career, from working in Scotland for 20 years in the plant fields, and now he's been at Davis since 2010, and he was out gallivanting South America for the past few weeks, helping them out with some issues that they're working on with plant disease. So I would say at the very least, he's got a lot of international experience. We got the chance to hear Neil speak at our conference and really enjoyed that, but he's going to talk about what really is resilience, and why do we have all these different definitions, and where does it come from, and kind of where do we need to go. So I'm going to be quiet and turn it over to Neil. And Neil, when kind of you're ready for me to move to the next slide, just let me know.
Will do, Josh. Thank you. Thanks for the introduction, and thanks for the opportunity to talk this morning or this afternoon or whatever time of day it is, wherever you are in the world. Hello, it's nice to meet you all online. Yeah, so what I'm going to do is look back to the 20 years in Scotland that Josh referred to, where I spent quite a bit of time working on policy support research for the Scottish Executive. And the context for that was that they had the requirement to try and work out how to spend the Common Agriculture Policy support money to deliver a basket of goods and services from agriculture, in addition to growing food. And it was a perpetual policy question. How do we best spend that money to get what we want? And in other words, how does the public purse buy what it wants from farming? So that's the kind of background. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the stuff that went on. I'm going to go through some technical definitions of sustainability and resilience. I'm going to talk a little bit about why they're gnarly subjects to try and get our arms around. I'm going to make a case for saying that we should stick to some fairly technical definitions at their core, but allow for the possibility and the probability that people are going to bring different connotations to the table with those words, but we shouldn't get too upset about that or too phased out about that, as long as we remember what the core technical meaning is. And I'm going to round off at the end by making some comments about the difficulty of trying to navigate policy trade-off, actually just by looking at the current presidential budget request for USDA for financial year 25, not to take pot shots at the current administration, but just to illustrate a couple of the points. And that question of how we navigate policy trade-offs in this space was really a conversation that Josh and I briefly had at the conference a few months ago, and that was really the stimulus to offer to give this webinar. So with that all said, off we go. Let's find out about resilience. So Josh, if you could give me the next slide, that'd be great. Okay, so go back to the middle of the early 2000s, and I'm working on agriculture policy in Scotland, and the executive then issued a policy briefing paper, and we were supposed to, as scientists, deliver a package of science that was going to deliver these things. So they called for a holistic interdisciplinary understanding of the interactions between social, economic management, environmental drivers, and so forth on farming systems. There was next point. They wanted to develop an acceptable range of criteria for farm resilience to test concepts of resilience under contrasting levels of management. Next point. They called for optimized models of farm scale management so that they could think about how farms might combine to deliver landscape scale environmental benefits. Next point. And then they asked for an evidence base that could be used to advise growers on solutions that were, and here we go, good for the environment and good for business. So you can see this is all very familiar stuff, at least now it is. And if you could click again, Josh, the three areas that I really worked on were the ones that are now highlighted. And so that gives the background in where the UK was, Scotland was, 15 years ago in terms of its policy development. So already then very interested in questions of resilience and how we deliver public policy across a wide array of areas, and in this case focused on farm system resilience, but everything that was true of that area of policy development applies across the One Health sphere now. There's nothing fundamentally different. Well, some of us were kind of jaded at this point in the policy cycle. It's about a 4 to 5 year long policy cycle in that environment, and I'd already been around it a couple of times with the policymakers, and in the previous cycles, everything was about sustainability. And then the vocabulary changed with this 2006 cycle, and suddenly sustainability was kind of pushed off stage to the side, and resilience appeared as the new central character. And if you could click to the next slide, Josh. And it kind of gave some of us the feeling that there was a certain feeling of the emperor's new clothes, So why did so much of the policy discussion give us the impression that we were hearing the same thing, just rebadged with a new set of vocabulary? And I'll say that the Bruegel painting there is superimposed over the top of the Emperor's New Clothes painting. It's strategically positioned because the Emperor really isn't wearing any clothes in that painting. So one of the things that really came out, I think, is encapsulated in the Bruegel painting and also the poem that W.H. Auden wrote that goes along with the painting after he saw it in the Musée des Beaux-Arts in Brussels. And in the lines of the poem that refer to the painting directly, he says, maybe the stuff that we thought that mattered as scientists didn't seem to matter to the stakeholders, because just as the ploughman in the painting is busy getting on with the business of ploughing his field and doesn't have any eye available to see Icarus fall from the sky and crash into the water in front of the beautiful ship, so the people that we were supposed to be helping were focused on the business of their lives, and some of the science and policy discussion simply was irrelevant to them as they went about their business. And so there was something of a mismatch. And in the next slide, that's kind of captured in a couple of cartoons by Larson about the dangers of what happens if we get too focused on reductionism when we're trying to build science to support policy. So I'll leave you to look at the cartoons. They both kind of make the same point about how we can become overly focused on the details of our pretty science. So somewhat in response to that, if you can click to the next slide, Josh, the team that I was working in, we came up with this mnemonic, I or you or me, which sounds like it might mean something, but it doesn't really if you think about it. But what is it? It was basically a guidance for policymakers to say, if you have competing pieces of science that are aiming to try and solve the same policy problem, how can you pick which one to fund? What's a good way of deciding who's going to hit the target? And so if we're thinking about sustainability and resilience, our idea was that you identify what it is that you want to be resilient, or you identify what it is that you want to sustain. Do you want to sustain wheat production, for example, or do you want to sustain wheat farms? And those aren't necessarily the same two things. Those are perhaps different policy objectives. In deciding the science to meet that target, it's often a good idea to use Occam's razor. It's not always true, but often, particularly in policy support, simple answers are going to be effective and often present a good trade-off between what's needed and what's possible. And then finally, follow the philosophy of methodological individualism, and that's a concept from political economics, which basically says if you want to explain something, the best place to start is at the next level down in the organizational hierarchy. So don't try and explain the behavior of the national economy in terms of the movement of protons. You know, the national economy is probably best explained by its components at the next level down. That kind of idea, that's the basic concept there. So those three things together give us a set of guidelines about how we can deliver science that's just at the right kind of level to explain the things that policymakers and stakeholders are interested in. At least that was our suggestion. So if we move to the next slide. So when it comes to sustainability, I think that we can't do a lot better than follow a couple of papers that Jim Hansen published in Agricultural Systems back in the 80s, where he really grappled with this question. What does sustainability mean? Why has it become such a fuzzy concept? And what can we do about it? And his suggestion was to go back to a literal, technical, system-oriented meaning. And it essentially comes down to identifying sustainability with what an engineer might call a failure time analysis, or what an epidemiologist like me would call a survival analysis. But essentially, Jim's suggestion was that sustainability, and we'll see how resilience feeds into that in a couple of minutes, sustainability is only really clearly defined if you think about a particular time interval. And then you can have an explicit meaning that says sustainability is the probability that the thing you're interested in sustaining survives over that given time interval. So there's some not too complicated, but still for some people off-putting looking mathematics behind that. But what I'd like to draw out in the next slide, Josh, is that the nice thing about what Jim did was that he defined this probability of failure, which is the thing in the integral in the equation, as a function of the instantaneous probability that the system fails in a given time interval, and a threshold value, which is the x with the subscript 0. So that immediately gives us a couple of places where we can attach actual operationalizable things in policy to the things we're interested in sustaining. We can think about them in terms of the risk that they'll fail, and we can think about them in terms of whatever threshold the system might need to cross in order for that failure to happen. So if you don't like working in the formalism of survival analysis, which is essentially what that is, then there's a simple approximation that's much more kind of easy to get your head around, which is you can think about this as a coin flipping game. So, you know, there's a probability that a coin will land heads or tails. So let's say that that's the P in the text here. So the probability at toss T that the coin lands heads or tails, whichever you don't want, is 0.5. Okay, and so if we're interested in it landing only one way consecutively, toss after toss after toss, then the probability that it manages to do that consecutively for T flips is 1 minus P to the T. And so the sustainability over time T is 1 minus that all, which is what the little equation at the end of the text shows. And then the graph just illustrates how that response function changes for different values of P. Okay, so this kind of way of thinking about sustainability is the probability, the accumulative probability of failure or surviving failure is one way to get at something that keeps us very much in a technical definition, but it still allows us to have lots of connotations around that kind of thinking. Okay, so if we move to the next slide, does it work? So here's a couple of examples of what you can think of as survival functions or failure functions for in a farming context for the US. So there's a data from 1999 by Drabenstadt that looks at the relationship between the number of corn farms and the price of corn over time, and you can see the number of farms went down over that interval, and there's a trend in the corn price that's downwards, but it moves up and down a little bit. And then on the right hand panel, that's an historical analysis from USDA looking at the number of farms and ranches in Wyoming, and you can see it after it peaked with the western expansion. It pretty much shows the same classic exponential decay function before it levels off over that period of time. So does the real world replicate the ideas involved in Hansen's idea of using survival analysis? Yes, it seems that it does at this kind of scale. So it may be a useful concept to unify thinking around sustainability. Let's move to the next slide. So why did policymakers switch in, at least back home, in talking about sustainability to talking about resilience? Well, ironically enough, it was because the conversation always drifted away from the technical meaning, and many of the groups of people who wanted to talk about sustainability brought a softer, more connotation-laden approach to talking about it. And so the concept, in a sense, became unmanageable. And ironically, now looking back, partly the response to that was that they decided that resilience would be a better thing to talk about. So you can see where this is going. So if you look at in the literature around the concept of resilience, this group led by Buzz Holling and Lance Gunderson really came to the fore during the 90s and early 2000s. And they very strongly proposed the idea that amongst the two major competing meanings of the word resilience that were around then, the one to go for was the ecological one, or what they called the adaptive view of resilience. And so their proposal was that resilience shouldn't assume that there's a single stable state that exists or is preferable. So their view that was the alternative view of resilience was too normative. Their view anticipates that systems will show cyclic behavior. And it takes an evolutionary perspective and says that a system can change over time and become something else. It's adaptive. That's where the adaptive piece comes from. And that resilience in this way is a component of sustainability. That's how the two things connect. So their view is really built around the idea that systems absorb shocks, and whatever configuration the system is in, it will stay in that configuration or close to it as long as the shock isn't too large. The alternative view is what they call the engineering view, which says which measures resilience in terms of the time it takes for the system to come back to the state it was in if it's shocked in some way. So you have these two different viewpoints in the literature, with this very strong, very vocal group of proponents for one view that dominated the discussion at that time. And their thoughts are really gathered into the book Panarchy, if you want to kind of get an overview of what they were saying at that time. So we move to the next slide. So here we have the two different viewpoints kind of in diagrammatic form. On the left, you can see what they called the engineering viewpoint, and their case was this sees system behavior in a serial way as a time series, longitudinal data sets going over time, and there's maybe some preferred value for the system average that we would like it to stay close to. And their view was this adaptive cycle, which has this thing called the lazy 8 in it, which goes through these phases that they labeled with the letters, alpha, kappa, omega, and R. And they did, I think, a nice job of empirically showing that this is true of many systems. You have these periods where resources are accumulated, they become focused in a small number of locations. Those locations eventually become unstable, they break down, the system goes back through another period of evolution where the resources are reaggregated again, and so on and so forth. So you have this serial view on the left side with the engineering return time perspective, and this vision on the right of the cyclic systems going round and round. But really, these aren't actually different viewpoints if you dig down and go underneath. So in the next slide, it's actually easy to take a serial time series and plot it in its phase space, which is what's shown underneath on the left-hand side. So that's just the same time series, but now all we've done, and this, by the way, in a One Health context, this is a risk index for a plant disease that we're looking at over time, over years. So now all we've done in the lower left plot is plot one season's risk index against the previous season's risk index, and you can see you turn something that was serial in the top plot into something that's cyclic in the bottom plot. And similarly, if instead of plotting connectivity against storage, as is done in the top diagram on the right hand side, now if we plot either connectivity or storage over time in a serial way, we can take the cyclic viewpoint from one version of resilience and turn it into something that looks exactly like a serial time series. So fundamentally, we can move between these two worlds, and really all that underlies the difference between them is in one viewpoint, we're thinking about the return time to a system value that we'd like, and in the other, we're thinking about the size of the shock that it takes to bounce a system out of an orbit around an attractor. And without going into the technical detail, both of those things really are connected with how deep the attractor is in the parameter space that it's in. And so the two views are fundamentally connected underneath. And so the one take home here is we don't have to worry about all the different technical meanings of resilience because they all come down to the same thing. And as Jim Stack would say, we all know what we're talking about when we use the word resilience. So it doesn't really matter if we all mean something slightly different if we remember that underlyingly there is a pretty unified technical definition for what this stuff actually means. So move on to the next slide. Okay, so here's an economic example, this time just to illustrate the same thing again. These are prices for barley. The black series is from the USDA. The yellow series was from Scotland around the same time. So the data series are kind of matched up so that they're either dollars or pounds per ton each year. And on the left, you've got the time series, and on the right, again, you've got the phase plot of 1 year's price against the previous year's price. And you can see in both cases, these are kind of hunting around a point in space where the price is more or less stable. It orbits around that value, at least during the intervals that are illustrated by these time series. So we can do the same thing with biological data and economic data, which is nice. We can get everything on the same kind of page here. So move on to the next one. Okay, so what are some of the technical implications for looking at this? Well, in the world of insect pest dynamics, Roy Amman has studied these kinds of things for a long time and wrote a very classic textbook in which he based a lot of population dynamics studies that are important in terms of One Health on looking at these kinds of data. But if we're interested in something being resilient, if we're interested in it being predictably sustainable, then there are some properties of time series that we'd like to see. We don't want fluctuations to go outside a particular range with high probability. To be truly sustainable, you want there to be no net long-term growth, something that perhaps economists would have an issue with. And then you want, this is a slightly more technical one, but a lot of work from Pete Turchin looking both at ecology and also more recently at human societies. There's an indicator value that you really want your trajectories to be non-chaotic and converge on an attractor, which is somewhat related to the first criterion there. So there are some technical things that we can specify about long-term behavior that actually ground the discussion in an analysis that could underlie policy discussions, while we allow a lot of subjective vocabulary to exist to allow people to talk about these things in terms of vocabulary that makes sense to them. So we don't have to be normative about this stuff, is what I'm saying. Okay, let's move on to the next slide. Okay. Well, let's move on to start thinking about how this works in practice. And I want to highlight here some work by a couple of the PhD students who are working with me at the moment, Katie Coleman and Sam Brinker. So if we think about how this stuff gets delivered in practice, then quite often what happens is that we have a policy objective, and at least in the world I work in, then quite often what will happen is that policy objective gets translated into a piece of science that's supposed to deliver or help the policymakers deliver on that target. And the idea here being that if the scientists come up with some clever idea or a tool, a decision support system, a piece of analysis, and show it to the population at what optimization theorists would call the follower level, then they'll get in line behind that clearly good idea and line up, and in the aggregate, if enough of them do that, we get policy success. So clearly this is something that's happening in at least a bi-level structure, right? And you've got at one level a set of policy objectives, maybe translated into science, and at the lower or follower level, you have a large number of individuals who need to do certain things in order for that policy to be delivered. So there's an interdependence between those two sets of objectives, and anyone who works in optimization theory knows that once you have this hierarchical structure with interdependent optimization functions at those two levels, it becomes a really pretty difficult optimization problem. Your standard mathematical programming models don't solve this kind of thing very easily. In fact, they don't solve it at all, but that's another story. Okay, so in this diagram, the big fat green arrow between the two layers, that's where scientists quite often find themselves, working to try and translate policy objectives into science with the hope that the follower population, whoever they are, the stakeholders, get behind the idea and deliver enough to deliver the policy. So let's take a look at what that might look like in another way. If you move to the next slide. Essentially, it's what I call the Pied Piper view of what science is supposed to deliver. You know, the scientist as the Pied Piper does his or her magic, and if the magic's strong enough, the stakeholders follow along to the magical world where policy's delivered. And so you can see this coming over and over again. It underlies the 100+ year vision of what land grant extension is supposed to do. It underlies the underlying thinking behind programs like the USDA HFAR program that funds much of the competitive research in food and ag in the US. And so if we think about how the national biosecurity strategy and implementation plan is going to work, which after all has to pull itself together from programs like HFAR, then it's going to inherit this same view that this is how we do it. We come up with clever ideas, and if they're clever enough, people will see that they're useful, get behind them, deliver the policy. Well, anybody who's worked in extension, anybody who's tried to study adoption of technology or ideas knows that this is something that works occasionally and often doesn't. It quite often doesn't matter how good your idea is. If the follower population doesn't want to or can't see the benefit, or any one of a number of other reasons that are well known and well documented by Rogers, amongst others, then they're not going to follow the Pied Piper, no matter how nice the tune is. And so there's some issues in delivering resilience here, because people are going to do what people are going to do. So if we move to the next slide. But let's take an idealized view of what would happen. So here we're looking at a simple simulation model. We've gone back to this idea of sustainability. Imagine there's a single decision point that determines whether your farm makes money or not through the year. And so there's a probability that if you make the wrong decision, you go out of business. Now imagine you have a scientist who's managed to improve that decision-making process to the point where it's more successful than not. So let's imagine you waste money if you decide to take action that you shouldn't have taken, maybe a very expensive piece of management that needs to happen if it needs to happen, but costs a lot of money if you do it and it wasn't necessary. So we have a false positive rate in our decision making. And on the vertical axis here, what we're looking at is the sustainability of these simulated farming enterprises over time, depending on that decision false positive rate. So this is essentially looking at what would happen if the population gets behind the new idea. So that's shown at the left-hand end, or maybe if you have a diversity of decision making where the false positive rate's rather high. So if you click a couple of times, Josh, we'll get to see what those different trajectories look like. So at the right-hand end, where there's a diversity of decision making going on, then you can see that how that plays out is that you get a diversity of trajectories over time, and many of them dip below the threshold where they fail. At the other extreme, at the left-hand end, where everybody's following the advice, eventually over time everybody lines up against the very low error rate, and everybody starts to make money, and all the trajectories are positive. So this is idealized. This is what the Pied Piper is supposed to deliver. Whether that ever happens in practice is a good question, but this is exactly what policymakers are relying on to deliver things like resilient policy. It has to be delivered through lots and lots of people all doing the right thing and continuously doing the right thing when we're talking about something like resilience. So let's move to the next slide. Okay, so it turns out that one of the reasons why it's difficult for us to get people to do this kind of thing is because people's mental models of things like sustainability are incredibly diverse, and there's the cognitive trade-off in terms of the kinds of information that people can store. So, and this is something we've studied quite a bit here. So basically, you can around a concept, you can have a mental model that has a lot of facts, but if you store a lot of facts, then it's difficult to store a lot of ideas about the connections amongst those facts unless you're very good at that kind of thing, but most people aren't. Or you can store a smaller number of facts, but have a much more richly connected concept of how those things connect with each other. And clearly, if you want to think about sustainability, then things like cycles and feedback loops and the behavior of complex systems have to be, to some extent, included in your mental model. But when you look at the mental models that even experts have about sustainability, very few people actually draw mental models that contain feedback loops. Most people's models are very one-dimensional and linear, even though we know we're talking about a subject where feedback is important. So there's a fundamental problem with us actually conceptualizing what underlies resilience and getting a very large number of people to accurately think about it because of the inherent difficulty of the subject. And then it's difficult to cross the sort of science to practice divide because it can be difficult to do that. Just a word of warning. Okay, so we move to the next slide. So beyond that, there are also dangers of actually connecting policy too much to evidence. So here's an example from work that we did on arable weed management, same context, too many herbicides being used. Policymakers want weed prediction models that cut down herbicide use. So here we have, again, a two-tier structure. And in the top set of output, the little black and white boxes, there's no connection between the policy cycle and the farming cycle. So there's no feedback between there's no, for example, nobody's measuring how much herbicide is being used and then adjusting policy as a consequence. And the hope, of course, is when you connect the policy to the dynamics of the real world, that the policy cycle drives the dynamics in the real world. But in this example, anyway, when we connect the two systems together, the opposite happens. And you get knee-jerk policy making based on last year's observation of how much herbicide was being used, which is just a warning shot to say, if we're going to drive policy from evidence, you have to think about the time scale over which you collect the evidence, or you get very rapid switches back and forward in your policy making, and that's fundamentally not a resilient mode of behavior. So again, in thinking about how we construct a stable, resilient national biosecurity strategy from the component pieces, we should be aware of this kind of issue with policy feedback. So next slide. Okay, so the central issue is to find a way to think about how these three domains connect together in a resilient way. And a One Health approach, which is the sort of principle that underlies the NBS, demands that we think about how these things are integrated. This is nothing new. So if we go to the next slide, there's been attempts to do this kind of thing before, perhaps most famously the models built by the Club of Rome group in the Beyond the Limits work that was done way back in the 70s and 80s. So some of the emperor's old clothes actually are systems models. And if we look at what happened when World 3 was released, it came in for a lot of criticism at the time, not least from economists who suggested that the linkages in the model were not properly constructed, or at least they could pick holes in them. And also that they felt that the model didn't include the ideas of substitution, which at least up to some point allow us to not run into limits. So this idea that what matters is the connections amongst domains is not a new idea. And if you can click again, Josh. So this is where, these connections between subcomponents in the model were highlighted. And this is really saying that what matters is the covariance between indicators in different domains. So what fundamentally we need to get our heads around if we want to not fall into bad policy design is to think about the covariance between the things we measure in different policy domains and work out how those are going to change together or in opposition from one another, to think about whether there are implications for policy design. So you can click again, Josh. Despite the criticisms that were leveled at the modeling work, the model actually didn't do a bad job of predicting what today would look like from back then. It was slightly pessimistic, but the basic qualitative results were relatively robust, actually. Okay, let's keep moving forward. I'm conscious of time here. Okay, so we've got the tools to do this kind of thing in lots of different domains, in lots of different disciplines. I'm just going to pick on one that's familiar to me. None of these things I'm going to say should be unfamiliar to people who work in other domains too. One of the big things that people are talking about building more resilient systems in agriculture at the moment in the plant world is the idea that we could manipulate the biome, the phytobiome, to work in our favor. I'm pessimistic about that viewpoint, I have to say. Here's some data from a paper showing the biome of plants measured in different years and in different locations on different hosts, and showing the percentage of species that are detected that map out on those in those situations. And so you can see that this group identified 1,480 different microbial species across the entire study. But between the two seasons, only 20% of the species identified were found in both years. And the question then comes, even if we could think about how to engineer such an incredibly complex system, what would you do given that there's such a low level of species consistency between years? Is the system too complex to be managed? Is the fundamental question. Okay, so let's move on to the next slide. It may well be the case that the system is too complex to be managed, but there are some things that we can take away from even that knowledge that might be useful. So here's a little toy model, and there's a couple of, I think, useful quotations. One from the world of engineering and ecology by Sir Robert May from his classic book, and the other from the world of social systems by Robert Boyd and Pete Rikerson. Here's a little toy model that has 3 domains, 3 species or 3 components in each subsystem. And so our interaction matrix, the community matrix for that system, looks like the box down below. So there's a box that tells us what's happening within each system. That's the sort of diagonal with the colored boxes. And then the off diagonal cells, those are where there are interactions or covariances or linkages between domains. So thinking about policy design from this perspective, we could perhaps reduce the problem to something manageable if it turns out that there are a small enough number of components for us to be able to make good decisions and predict what's going to happen. But word of warning, here's a little toy system with just 9 components organized into 3 subdomains. And on the next slide, if we look at what happens in terms of the dynamics, there are actually 8 different patterns of dynamic behavior if we just take a projection matrix approach and look at how that system might behave based on the covariances that are there in the model. So even something as simple as a 3x3 model. So imagine we have a social component, an environmental component, and an economic component, and we decide to measure just three metrics for each of those. This is the kind of mess we might end up looking at, trying to decide how we put those things together to build policy. Well, is it a hopeless case? No, I don't believe it is. So if we move to the next slide, there's some really good work being done by Orjan Bodin and colleagues at the Stockholm Resilience Centre, and they published this paper just a couple of years ago, actually focused on this question of what lies between policy aspirations and delivery. And it turns out that there are a couple of not surprising things. One is the length of the path between the policy aspiration and the domain where it's delivered. So in other words, a long policy pathway between dreaming and delivery allows for lots of opportunities for things to go wrong. And one of the ways that a policymaker may be frustrated in their aspiration and when it's not delivered is that along that pathway, there are opportunities for exactly this problem of interdependence and trade-off to enter into the picture. A long pathway is likely to encounter trade-offs with other policy areas. But thinking around this problem already exists, and so I think there's some hope for us being able to tackle it, perhaps by following the kinds of methods that Orjan and his colleagues are using in Stockholm at the moment. But I want to round off, and I think this is my last slide coming, so maybe leave a couple of minutes for discussion, just by showing how this kind of issue can come up, particularly in situations where there's budgetary constraint. So this is, and I have to stress here, this is purely for illustration. I am by no means taking a pot shot at the current administration, but here's the USDA documenting their piece of the presidential budget request for financial year 25. So I've just pulled a few of the tables out of here to illustrate some points. The top table is looking at the sustainable supplemental agricultural disaster assistance programs. And I just draw your attention to the last 2 lines in that table there. The TAP, that's the tree assistance program. So that provides supplement money to growers who want, for reasons of loss of productivity or natural disaster, to renew crops that fall into the covered categories of tree production. So lots of our nuts and fruits and things that are highly nutritious. So if you want to build a good nutrition program, you want it to be resilient and not rely on imports, then you want growers to be able to replace orchards when needed. And you can see the suggestion is for that program to go down from 49 to 11 million in the current financial year. Contrast that underneath, the ELAP is one of the livestock assistance programs, and probably partly because of recent and ongoing experience with problems in livestock disease, you can see that that's been slated for an increase. So budget constraints, budget choices necessarily have policy implications about different pieces of the food supply chain. The next table down shows some winners and losers from the Natural Resources Conservation Service, and you can look through there and see the several programs there are penciled in for some pretty hefty increases in this year's budget, and that reflects an interest in delivering a broad basket of goods and services from agriculture. So the administration here is starting to turn towards some ideas perhaps that were around in Europe not so long ago and actually are still central to the European policy framework for agriculture. So big winners here, but of course big winners in one domain mean losers elsewhere when the overall budget's fixed. And so if we come to some of the things where, for example, passive surveillance and some issues that are directly of interest to biosecurity and health and food and agricultural resilience, here are some budget lines for some of those programs from the NEFA budget. And I'm just going to draw your attention to the very top one in that table. The Crop Protection and Pest Management Program, CPPM, is the program that funds the regional IPM centres. And you can see that the presidential budget request has indicated a fairly hefty cut in that area from 21 to $3 million. Now, here's a really clear example of policy mismatch, because IPM is seen as a way to deliver sustainable, resilient pest management and some of the aspirations of the National Biosecurity Strategy from a One Health perspective. But at the same token, here we have a very clear case where that broad policy goal is not being supported by the executive branch decision in this case. Okay, so I'm going to wrap up there and say, of course, this is just, people often say that the PBR is dead on arrival at the legislature. So of course, there's a long way to go before any of these things are decided. But I just wanted to highlight where you can see these kinds of problems in action within policy decisions that are being made in real time. So with that, I'll wrap up. Josh, I hope I did justice to the subject. As I said to you before everybody joined, I'm by no means an expert in most of this stuff.
I appreciated it. And as an economist, when you're doing the graphs, we often talk about and again, I'll take the no political approach, but if you're a libertarian, you believe everybody kind of behaves rationally, which is how your policy model way back at the beginning with the graphs, you expect everybody to behave. And in reality, what's normal for one person is not necessarily normal for another. And that's why you don't get those direct trade-offs and you do get those bounces. So I found that, as an economist, that sense appealed to me. And then the discussion of sustainability is, I even go so far back when you're talking about it, when they shifted to resilience is, well, sustainable for whom? If it's sustainable for having 1,000 farmers that make $10 or 10 farmers that make thousands of dollars, or the sustainable mean it just lasts longer, or, so those definitions are very difficult, but I do think, you drew out a pretty important thing, that the policy aspect assumes everybody behaves rationally, and we always don't see that.
Yeah.
And yeah. I can't see the question because I'm sharing the screen in case I have to go back, but Marcy, if you have questions in the chat, or if anybody has questions, feel free to ask them now.
There's no questions in the chat, and I've let everybody, they can unmute and ask a question right now as well.
So I've got the slides up. And I was going to go back to, yeah, let me get back to this slide. I want to ask a specific question. Neil, with respect to this question where you talked about policy, are you specifically, you're saying the length of time it takes from the policy to be put in, to when it gets discussed to when it gets put in place?
I think their work suggests it's not so much the length of time, although that's going to be correlated with the thing they do talk about. What they're saying is the number of intervening steps between the domain where the policy is created and the place where it gets enacted in practice. So if that's a long chain of, if there's a lot of actors involved along that chain to get you to the point where you actually generate delivery, then each one of those actors is going to be connected to another system, and that may then introduce opportunities for the policy to be skewed or pulled off course because it interacts with another set of objectives that that actor may have.
So it's almost, and if you've never, I'm sure you've played it. It's almost like the secret game where when you grew up, where at one end I told you that the roses are red only when it's the month of October. And then you passed along, and by the time it got to the end, it's October is red and we have blue tulips.
Right.
That's true. Everybody's going to put their little piece in that influences what they think is important, whether that's the original intent. And I do think that the piece about the number of years of data is important, but I also think how do you overcome that when you're trying to address an issue fairly quickly? Is it you almost do nothing, or do you go back to your Occam's razor principle and do something that's very, very simple that you've seen work before?
I mean, I think there's definitely a temptation to do that. We see that in we see that in the regulatory world a lot when a new species, a new invasive species arrives. Often there's not enough information to make biologically based decisions, and regulators will go back to thresholds and delimitation radii and all these kinds of things that have worked in other programs. And if that continues long enough, you can end up with, statistical models being used to calculate sample sizes for systems that they were never designed for, but they've been inherited through a long series of one program after another, and they end up being used in areas where they're not appropriate without ever being re-examined. So heuristics can be dangerous in that sense if they sort of work, and they don't make enough mistakes to be catastrophically bad, but they're grossly inefficient. They can still survive because it's the quickest way to get something in place. So there's definitely some of that goes on. But yeah, length of data series is a recurring problem, and then you have to basically fall back on the idea of trying to build your analysis from plausible plausible assumptions about underlying causality, and see what that gives you.
Yeah. And then I have one more question. I know we're getting close to time and everybody's probably getting ready to bump off, but when you talked about the engineering aspect, and we were here, and how do we, and I guess in economics, you oftentimes see where we make this, you have fixed costs for a while and you can use it, you have a stepwise cost function. All of a sudden you get to a spot and you have to introduce a new, and you're on a new cost function. How do we know that this adaptive, even though they're linked, which you had said, this adaptive approach is actually not, jumping to this new system is actually not better for sustainability because now we've adapted to a new system?
I think that's the hard thing, right? Is that we have to accept that for a lot of this stuff, our ability to have stable or fixed policy targets is really quite limited. You know, the planning horizon, if you like, for policy lifetime needs to be realistically short to allow for that kind of thing. And we often don't know when the system moves to a new domain whether it truly is sustainable or not. So to give you an example, which is something else I've looked at for quite a bit, you know, in particularly in farming systems, and I assume it's true in other kinds of business operation. And what we quite often see is that over time you end up with a bimodal distribution. You know, the middle drops out, the disappearing middle, and that happens at a range of different scales. And it seems to be a scale independent phenomenon in many systems, right? There's a sort of middle size, so let's say in US agriculture, family farm size is in many systems not manageable. You're too big to be able to do everything for zero cost labor in the family. You're too small to get the benefits of large scale production. And so you have the choice of either trying to grow or to shrink down to where you can maybe service a niche market and drop into part-time farming, maybe part-time organic farming, where you can, you know, where there's some market that has a relatively high price. So over time, you get this hollowing out in the size distribution. Is that less sustainable? Is that less resilient? It's an open question, right? It depends, as you said, Josh, it depends what you want to sustain. If what you want to sustain are family farms, then yes, that's less resilient. That new configuration, that new bimodal configuration of the system is less
If you wanted to sustain food production across the US, maybe it's not. I mean,
maybe it's not. It depends on your policy priority.
well, I know we're bumping right up against time here, but you know, this was really good. And I'm a numbers guy, so I liked it, but it gives us a lot to think about. And I think even as we're, you know, in our group and working on, as I said at the beginning, kind of sent out that information about, you know, if you've got some infographics or some white papers related to these topics or some summaries that you want to share with us, and we can get up on our website and then up on LinkedIn. I think these are some topics like this that will engage policyholders to think about what is the true intent of our policy and being able to accomplish items. And I think you gave us some great references there. And Marcy, we'll make this, I'm speaking for Marcy here, so hopefully I don't get in trouble. We'll make this available for everybody. And when the website's up and running, it'll also be on our website. So, Neil, I really appreciate it. I learned a lot, and you provided some valuable insight here for us. So thank you so much.
A pleasure, Josh. Thanks very much for the opportunity.
I hope everyone has a wonderful day. Bye.
Bye, everybody.